The road twisted and turned as they drove deeper into Blackwood Forest, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees. Emma sat in the passenger seat, buzzing with excitement. She'd been the one to convince the others to come here, an impulsive getaway to escape their hectic lives. Jess, Lucas, and Ryan had been reluctant at first, but Emma had an infectious energy, and soon enough, they'd all agreed. "This place is supposed to be amazing," Emma said, tapping her phone screen, showing off pictures from the travel blog she'd found. "No cell service, no people, just nature and us." "Can't wait." Jess, who was driving, cast a sideways glance at the dense forest. The trees seemed taller here, older, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The road was narrowing, the light dimming as the sun began to set. She felt a pang of unease but shook it off. This was supposed to be fun. They needed this. "It's definitely remote," Ryan muttered from the back seat, staring out at the endless stretch of woods. "Feels like we're in the middle of nowhere." "That's the point, right?" Lucas chimed in, his voice a little too cheery. "Disconnect from the world, clear our minds." Jess nodded, but her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The forest pressed in on them as if it had been waiting for their arrival. As they finally pulled up to the designated campsite, a clearing surrounded by towering trees, the car's headlights revealed a simple, bare space. A fire pit, a few logs for sitting, and enough room to pitch their tents. They stepped out of the car, the sudden stillness of the forest wrapping around them like a blanket. No hum of distant traffic, no buzzing of phones, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. The silence was almost suffocating. "I love it already," Emma grinned, throwing her backpack over her shoulder and heading toward the center of the clearing. Ryan let out a low chuckle. "I don't know, man. This feels a little too much like the setup for a horror movie. Bunch of city kids out in the woods, no signal, creepy forest." "Shut up, Ryan," Jess said, though she smiled. "You're going to freak yourself out." They set up their tents quickly as the sun sank lower, casting the forest in deep shadows. Emma was the only one who seemed entirely at ease, humming to herself as she unpacked her things. Jess couldn't help but glance at the tree line. The trees seemed too still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. The feeling of being watched prickled at the back of her neck, and she caught herself staring into the darkened woods more than once. When the fire was finally lit, its orange glow cast flickering shadows over their faces. The warmth was welcome, but it didn't quite chase away the growing unease that Jess couldn't explain. As they sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing, Jess's eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Every crackle of a branch, every gust of wind through the leaves made her heart beat a little faster. Emma, who was always the storyteller of the group, leaned forward, her face lit eerily by the flames. "You know," she began in a low, conspiratorial tone, "I read something about this forest, something the blog didn't mention." Ryan groaned. "Here we go." "No, seriously," Emma continued, a mischievous smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "The locals, well, the ones who still talk about it, say the forest is haunted." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You're not serious?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide with mock seriousness. "Oh, but I am. There's a legend about Blackwood. They say it's a place where people go missing. Not just the normal, lost in the woods kind of missing, but..." She paused for effect, lowering her voice. "People disappear. No trace. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky, the forest brings them back, but not as they were. The fire crackled loudly, and for a moment, Jess could have sworn she heard something out in the woods, a distant whisper, barely audible over the sound of the flames. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "That's just some old ghost story," Ryan said, but there was an edge to his voice that betrayed his unease. "Come on, Emma. Don't start with this crap." Emma grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "What? Scared?" "Of course not," Ryan shot back, though his eyes flickered to the trees just for a moment. The conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but the mood had shifted. The stories and jokes seemed forced now, and Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness beyond the firelight. As the evening wore on, her unease grew, the shadows stretching longer, the woods around them eerily quiet. By the time they retreated to their tents, the fire was just glowing embers, and the night had fully closed in. Jess lay in her sleeping bag, staring up at the dark canvas of the tent, her heart pounding for no reason she could name. The others had fallen asleep quickly, their soft breathing blending with the wind that now whispered through the trees. But Jess couldn't sleep. There was a tension in the air, something thick and heavy that weighed on her chest. She tried to convince herself it was just the strangeness of being in the wilderness, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew it was something more. She rolled over, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling that eyes were watching her from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. Outside, the wind picked up, the sound of it rising to a low moan as it whipped through the trees, and then she heard it. A faint, barely there whisper carried on the wind. Jess. Her name. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. She strained to listen, but the only sound was the wind and the soft rustling of leaves. It must have been her imagination. It had to be. But as she lay back down, her pulse racing, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to leave them alone. Morning came slowly in Blackwood Forest, the pale light of dawn barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees. Jess awoke with a start, her mind still lingering on the unsettling dreams that had filled the night. She sat up, blinking the sleep from her eyes and trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all felt too real. But it was morning now, and everything was supposed to be fine. Stepping out of her tent, Jess was greeted by the cool, crisp air of the forest. The camp was quiet, too quiet. She glanced around and noticed that Emma's tent was already empty, the flap open and her hiking boots gone. "Morning," Ryan grunted, stretching as he emerged from his tent, his hair disheveled. "Where's Emma?" "She must have gone for an early hike," Jess said, trying to keep her voice casual, though a knot of unease was forming in her stomach. "She mentioned something about exploring the trails before we got started today." Ryan nodded but frowned slightly as he scanned the tree line. "She's been gone a while, though. How early could she have left?" Jess glanced at the sky. The sun was already climbing higher, and she realized that it had to be at least mid-morning. A sense of unease settled in, but she pushed it aside. Emma was probably fine, just taking her time and enjoying the solitude of the forest. Still, something about the silence in the camp felt wrong. By the time Lucas joined them, yawning and rubbing his eyes, Emma still hadn't returned. They decided to wait, figuring she'd wander back eventually. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and then another, the anxiety became impossible to ignore. "Okay, this is weird," Lucas said, pacing around the fire pit. "Emma wouldn't just vanish like this. She's got no signal out here, and she's not the type to go off for hours without saying something." Jess nodded, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "We should go look for her. Maybe she got turned around on one of the trails." Ryan stood, stretching his legs. "Yeah, that sounds like Emma. She probably lost track of time or found some cool view. She'll be back before we know it." But the unease in his voice didn't go unnoticed. They all felt it, the growing tension, the creeping sense that something was wrong. Jess grabbed her jacket and flashlight, and soon they were splitting into two groups, with Jess and Ryan heading west toward the forest trails, and Lucas staying behind at the campsite in case Emma came back. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Jess couldn't shake the eerie silence that enveloped them. The trees, which had seemed merely old and imposing the night before, now felt oppressive, as if they were watching their every move. There were no birds singing, no rustling of animals, only the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a distant branch. "Emma!" Ryan called out, his voice bouncing off the trees and returning as a hollow echo. No answer. Jess felt a chill crawl up her spine as they continued along the narrow trail, their footsteps growing quieter the further they went. The forest was playing tricks on her, she was sure of it. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. Every whisper of wind sounded like a voice just beyond her hearing. And then they found the boots. In a small, secluded clearing, Emma's hiking boots sat neatly side by side in the middle of the path. They looked untouched, perfectly placed as if she had stepped out of them deliberately. But there were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, just the boots, left in the stillness of the forest. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, taking a step back. This doesn't make sense." Jess knelt beside the boots, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out a hand, hesitating just before touching them. They were Emma's, no doubt about it. But how had she left them here? Why? "Emma," Jess called, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" The only reply was the wind, softly rustling through the trees, and the growing sense that something unseen, was watching them from the shadows. Ryan crouched next to Jess, his face pale. "She wouldn't just leave her boots here. This can't be right." Jess stood, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she scanned the forest around them. The trees loomed closer, their branches seeming to twist and reach toward them. The oppressive silence was deafening now, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We need to go back," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something's wrong, Ryan. Really wrong." Ryan nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "Yeah, let's get back to camp. Maybe she'll be there by the time we return." But as they turned to leave, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the forest was closing in around them. The trees felt alive, their bark etched with strange markings that hadn't been there before, twisted symbols that made her skin crawl. They hurried back the way they came, but the forest seemed to have changed. The path, which should have led them straight back to the campsite, twisted and forked in ways it hadn't before. Jess's heart pounded harder, panic rising as she realized they were no longer sure of the way. "Jess," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "This isn't right. We've been down this trail before, but it doesn't look the same." Jess fought the urge to panic, forcing herself to breathe slowly. "We'll find our way back. We need to stay calm." But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Something about Blackwood Forest was different, something beyond the natural. The air was heavy with an unspoken threat, the kind of feeling that made her skin prickle and her instincts scream to run. After what felt like hours, they stumbled back into camp, their hearts racing and their minds buzzing with unanswered questions. Lucas was sitting by the fire, his face pale as he stared into the flames. "She didn't come back," he said softly, not looking up. I thought I saw her, though, just for a second." Jess froze. "You saw Emma?" Lucas nodded, his hands trembling. "Yeah. I don't know. It looked like her. She was just standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I called out to her, but she didn't answer. And then, she was gone. Like she was never there." Ryan swore under his breath, running his hands through his hair. "What the hell is going on here?" Jess felt her stomach twist. The whispers from the night before, the eerie silence, the strange symbols. None of it made sense. But now, with Emma missing and the forest twisting around them, she couldn't deny that something was horribly wrong. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. Jess could feel it now, the heavy weight of something unseen pressing in from all sides. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to their camping trip. It was alive, watching, waiting. And whatever had taken Emma was still out there. Dusk settled over Blackwood Forest like a shroud, deepening the shadows that clung to the trees. Jess sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames, but her mind was far from the warmth of the camp. Emma was still missing. Hours had passed since their unsettling discovery of her empty boots in the clearing, and nothing about the situation felt right. It wasn't just that Emma had vanished, it was the way the forest itself seemed to warp around them, twisting their sense of direction and making the air heavy with a presence they couldn't see. Lucas sat across from her, pale and trembling, his eyes darting nervously toward the trees. Every crackle of the fire made him flinch, his fingers twitching as though he expected something to leap from the shadows at any moment. "We need to go," Ryan said suddenly, breaking the silence. He had been pacing for the last half hour, unable to sit still, his face set in a grim mask of fear. "Emma's gone. Whatever this place is, there's something wrong here. I don't care if we have to hike through the night. We have to leave." Jess's heart clenched. She wanted to agree. Everything inside her screamed that they needed to get out of Blackwood, that this place was more than just an eerie forest. It was something darker, something dangerous. But leaving meant giving up on Emma. And Jess couldn't shake the feeling that leaving might be exactly what the forest wanted. Lucas's voice was barely above a whisper. "We can't just leave her. What if she's out there? What if she's hurt?" Ryan stopped pacing and turned to face them, his eyes wild. "We've looked everywhere, Lucas. We've called her name 100 times. She's not answering because she's not out there. Or if she is, she's not. She's not coming back." Jess looked at Ryan, her stomach twisting. "What are you saying?" Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm saying, Jess. All I know is this place isn't normal. Emma's gone, and this forest, it feels like it's messing with our heads. I feel like I'm going crazy." Before Jess could respond, a cold gust of wind swept through the camp, extinguishing the fire with a soft hiss. Darkness enveloped them, thick and impenetrable. Jess fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she switched it on. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing the strange symbols once again etched into the trees surrounding their camp. They hadn't noticed them before, not this close, not this clear. They were everywhere now, spiraling up the trunks like ancient runes. Jess's breath caught in her throat. "Ryan, look." He turned and his face went ashen as his eyes locked onto the symbols. "What the hell is that?" Lucas stood abruptly, backing away from the trees, his voice cracking with fear. "I saw those before, when we were looking for Emma. What do they mean?" Before Jess could answer, a low murmur began to rise from the forest, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder by the second. It was a sound that chilled Jess to the bone, like the voices of 100 people whispering in unison. The whispers surrounded them, slipping between the trees and blending with the wind, speaking in a language none of them understood. Jess's heart pounded in her chest. She swept the flashlight toward the tree line, but the beam only illuminated more twisted shapes in the bark, more symbols carved into the ancient wood. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, she saw movement. "Ryan, did you see that?" Jess whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ryan grabbed a flashlight from his pack and shined it in the same direction, his breath quickening. At first, there was nothing but shadows, and then they saw her. Emma. She stood at the edge of the trees, her face half obscured by the darkness. Her clothes were dirty, her hair disheveled, but it was her. There was no mistaking it. Jess felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. Something about Emma's posture was off. She stood too still, her head slightly tilted to one side, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Emma!" Lucas shouted, stepping toward her, but Jess grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait!" Something was wrong. Emma didn't move, didn't react. She just stood there, staring at them from the shadows, her expression blank and unsettling. Jess's skin crawled, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. "Emma?" Jess called, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Emma's lips moved, but no sound came out. It was like she was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't form. Her mouth opened and closed in slow, deliberate motions, as though she was mimicking speech, but the silence remained. Ryan took a step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Emma, where have you been? We've been looking for you everywhere." But Emma didn't respond. Her head tilted further, almost unnaturally, and then she began to move, slowly at first, stepping out of the shadows. As the light from their flashlights fell across her face, Jess's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Emma. Not really. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too empty. Her movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. And then, without warning, she lunged forward, her mouth twisting into a grotesque, unnatural smile. Jess screamed, stumbling backward as the thing that looked like Emma reached for her with clawed fingers. Lucas froze, his eyes wide with terror, as the thing that had once been their friend moved toward him next, its limbs moving in horrifying, exaggerated motions. Ryan grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and swung it wildly, shouting, "Stay back! Stay away from us!" The thing paused for a moment, its head snapping toward Ryan with a sickening crack, its smile never faltering. The whispers from the forest grew louder, the strange language swirling around them in a maddening crescendo. Jess's heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing for a way out. "Run!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. They bolted into the forest, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tore through the undergrowth. The whispers followed them, growing louder, faster, like a chorus of voices pushing them deeper into the woods. Jess's lungs burned as she ran, her mind reeling from what she had just seen. The thing that had looked like Emma. It couldn't have been real, but it was, and it was still out there. Ryan ran beside her, his breath ragged. What the hell was that? What's happening? I don't know, Jess gasped, her heart pounding in her ears. We just have to keep moving. Behind them, Lucas stumbled and fell with a cry, his flashlight skidding across the ground. Jess turned back, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him struggling to get up, the shadows closing in around him. But before she could go to him, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, and Lucas's scream was cut short. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. We can't stop. Jess, we have to go. Tears stung her eyes as they ran, the forest warping around them, the symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. The trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, reaching for them like claws. Jess's mind spun with terror, her body moving on instinct as they fled deeper into the cursed forest. The shadows closed in, and the whispers followed. The darkness of Blackwood Forest swallowed Jess and Ryan whole as they stumbled through the undergrowth, hearts pounding in their chests, breaths ragged. The trees blurred together in the night, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal hands, grabbing at them as they fled. The whispers had grown louder now, an endless chorus of overlapping voices that scraped against Jess's mind, twisting her thoughts until they felt like they weren't her own. She couldn't stop thinking about Lucas. His scream, the look of terror on his face just before he was pulled into the shadows. His voice cut off as if the forest itself had devoured him. He was gone, just like Emma. Her legs felt like they were on fire, her muscles screaming with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to keep running, to not look back. But the forest was endless, a labyrinth that kept twisting and folding in on itself, like it was alive, bending to trap them in its grasp. We have to find a way out, Ryan gasped, his face pale and streaked with dirt and sweat. He clutched Jess's arm, pulling her forward as the two of them broke into another clearing. For a moment, Jess allowed herself to hope. The clearing was open and bathed in a faint sliver of moonlight, unlike the suffocating blackness of the woods. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through. But then she saw it. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin, small, dilapidated, and ancient. Its wooden boards were weathered and rotting, its windows dark and lifeless. It looked as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. But there was something wrong about it, something far worse than the empty woods. Jess stopped dead in her tracks, her heart dropping into her stomach. The sight of the cabin sent a chill down her spine that was colder than the night air. It felt like the center of everything, the source of the whispers, the thing that had taken Emma, Lucas, and now them. Ryan grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. We have to keep going. It's our only choice. We can't stay out here. Jess wanted to scream at him that it wasn't safe, that the cabin was somehow worse than the forest, but the words wouldn't come. Something drew them forward, a force she couldn't explain. They approached the door, the wind howling around them, as if trying to push them away, warning them to turn back. But they didn't, because they couldn't. With trembling hands, Ryan reached for the door and pushed it open. The inside of the cabin was just as Jess had feared, dark, cold, and suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor creaked beneath their weight as they stepped inside. Shadows clung to every corner, and the walls were etched with the same twisted symbols they had seen on the trees outside. In the far corner of the room, a figure sat hunched in the shadows, so still that at first Jess thought it was part of the cabin itself. But as they stepped closer, she realized it was a person, their form cloaked in layers of tattered fabric, their face hidden beneath a hood. Ryan froze, his hand gripping Jess's arm as they stared at the figure. Who are you?" The figure didn't move for a long moment, and then, slowly, they lifted their head. Pale eyes gleamed from beneath the hood, old and clouded with age. The voice that emerged was like the wind through the trees, raspy and brittle. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a shiver through Jess's body. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "What is this place? What's happening to us?" The figure let out a low, bitter laugh. "Blackwood Forest. It's a gate. A place that lives between worlds, between what is real and what is not. It's always been hungry." Jess's breath caught in her throat. The whispers, the symbols, the way the forest seemed to shift around them. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. But why? Why us? The figure's pale eyes flickered toward her, their gaze piercing. "It chooses who to take. You came here, willingly into its heart, and now it feeds on you." Ryan shook his head, his voice breaking. "That thing we saw, Emma, she's still out there. What happened to her? Can we save her?" The figure's expression twisted into something like pity. "Your friend? She's gone. The forest took her, twisted her, as it has done to so many before her. It keeps what it takes and wears their skin, but it's not her. Not anymore." Jess felt the floor sway beneath her as her legs nearly gave out. The truth hit her like a punch to the chest. Emma was never coming back. Lucas was gone, and now the forest was closing in on them. Ryan's voice was desperate. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." The figure was silent for a long moment, and when they finally spoke, their voice was soft, almost a whisper. "There is no way out. The forest does not let go. Once you are inside, it has already claimed you." Jess's blood turned to ice. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The whispers outside grew louder, closer, until they filled the cabin, swirling around her mind like a terrible storm. They were part of it now, part of whatever dark thing lived in the heart of Blackwood Forest. Ryan stepped forward, his hands trembling, his face a mask of disbelief. "No, that's not possible. There has to be something." Before he could finish, the door of the cabin creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept inside. Jess turned toward the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the pale moonlight, was Emma, or what was left of her. Her face was twisted into that same grotesque, puppet-like smile, her limbs jerking unnaturally as she moved forward. Behind her, the shadows shifted, taking shape, becoming something more, something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for them all along. Jess's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her eyes wide with horror. The truth of Blackwood Forest was clearer now than ever. They had never stood a chance. The forest had chosen them, just as it had chosen Emma and Lucas, and now it was time for it to claim them too. Jess felt the cold shadows close in around her, the whispers filling her mind until there was nothing left but darkness. and Blackwood Forest would feed. The door creaked shut behind them, and the forest grew quiet once more.